Lyra Solari had never intended to catch the Alpha King indulging in a primal obsession within the sanctity of her private study. She had returned from the royal wing exhausted, her mind sharp but weary after a grueling afternoon of vetting the seventh and final potential bride for the most formidable monarch in the Northern Territories. What she found standing by her mahogany desk forced the air from her lungs. King Fenris Ulric was leaned over her workspace, his massive, broad-shouldered frame silhouetted against the amber glow of the hearth. In his scarred hands, he held the silk scarf she'd draped over her chair, a delicate fabric imbued with her personal scent of sun-warmed citrus and cold steel. He held it to his face, his eyes hooded and dark, inhaling with a slow, rhythmic intensity that bordered on the predatory. The moment the door clicked, his posture went lethal and still. The scarf dropped onto the desk. When he turned, his piercing gaze locked onto hers with the weight of a physical blow, stripping away her professional composure in a single heartbeat. Lyra. His voice was a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated in her chest. There was no shame in his expression, only a dark, simmering challenge. "Your Majesty," Lyra managed, her voice remarkably steady despite the frantic thrumming of her pulse. She remained anchored in the doorway, refusing to show the flicker of fear that usually kept her alive in the syndicate. "I was unaware the king required a private audience in my personal quarters." A muscle tightened in his rugged jaw. "I came for the dossiers on the final candidate. I found myself preoccupied." Preoccupied. The word was a lie that hung heavy in the room. Kings did not get preoccupied by the scent of their matchmakers unless they were hunting something far more dangerous than a bride. Lyra had been embedded in this court for months with a singular, high-stakes mission: find Fenris Ulric a queen who could be controlled by Silas Graves and the syndicate. Matchmaker. That was the mask she wore for the court. It was a role she had mastered over years of living in the shadows, built on a foundation of absolute discretion and the desperate need to keep her brother, Bram, safe from Silas's reach. 7 women. She had presented him with 7 impeccable matches, each one a masterpiece of beauty, lineage, and political leverage. She had done her job perfectly, selecting women designed to shore up his borders and stabilize his crown. Yet, as the king stepped out of the shadows and toward her, his presence crowded her space, smelling of rain and ancient pine. He didn't look like a man seeking a political alliance. He looked like a wolf who had just cornered his prize. Every instinct screamed at Lyra to retreat, to hide the secrets etched into her soul, but his intense focus pinned her in place. His eyes never wavered from her own, making it chillingly clear that while she had been looking at the 7, he had only ever been looking at her. The heavy silence of the study was broken only by the rhythmic crackle of the hearth, the orange light dancing across Fenris Ulric's broad shoulders as he stood hunched over Lyra's desk. He didn't move when she entered, but the air in the room shifted, growing thick with the scent of pine needles and impending thunder. Lyra remained frozen, her hand still white-knuckled on the door handle, watching as the Alpha King finally lowered her silk scarf. The fabric, once a barrier between her skin and the world, now looked fragile in his calloused, battle-scarred hands. When he turned, his eyes were 2 burning embers in the dim light. Lyra felt the familiar, sharp instinct of a survivor, the urge to mask her scent, to flatten her presence into something invisible. But Fenris saw everything. He didn't offer a hollow apology for invading her sanctuary. Instead, he tracked her movements with a predatory focus that made her skin prickle. "I have the final report for the 7th candidate, Lady Isolde," Lyra said, her voice cutting through the tension with practiced, professional steel. She moved toward the desk, carefully avoiding the space he occupied, and placed a leather-bound dossier between them. "She is the jewel of the Southern Reach. Her lineage is impeccable, her temperament is stable, and her dowry would secure your borders for a century." Fenris didn't even glance at the book. He stepped closer, his massive frame looming over her until she was forced to look up, meeting the raw intensity of his gaze. "Isolde smells of lavender and expensive oils," he rumbled, his voice a low vibration that seemed to echo in Lyra's very bones. But beneath the perfume, She smells of stagnant water. She smells of a woman performing a part for a crown she doesn't respect. Lyra swallowed hard, her pulse jumping in the hollow of her throat. She is a perfect match for the throne, sire. My job was to find you a queen who could lead. Your job was to find me a mate, Fenris countered, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as he leaned down, his face inches from hers. He didn't touch her, but the heat radiating from him was a physical weight. He inhaled sharply, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent he had been chasing, the sun-warmed citrus and sharp, cold steel that was uniquely Lyra. The 7 you brought me are ghosts. They are curated lies wrapped in silk. Not one of them has the fire of a woman who has walked through hell and come out forged in iron. He reached out then, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw with a touch so light it was almost a question. You smell of truth, Lyra Solari. You smell of secrets and survival. Lyra's breath hitched. She was a syndicate plant, a woman built on a foundation of deception, yet he was claiming to see the reality she worked so hard to bury. As his eyes searched hers, demanding an honesty she couldn't afford to give, the professional boundary she had built between them didn't just crack, it shattered. The 7 brides were forgotten shadows. In the flickering firelight, there was only the hunter and the woman who had finally been found. The scent of the Alpha King's pine and rain still clung to Lyra's skin, a lingering ghost of the encounter at her study that made the damp night air of the royal gardens feel freezing by comparison. She hurried through the labyrinth of manicured hedges, her boots clicking softly on the stone path, until she reached the weeping willow at the edge of the reflecting pool. The moonlight was swallowed by heavy clouds, leaving the world in a bruised shade of indigo. You're late, Lyra. The voice didn't come from the shadows. It was the shadows. Silas Graves stepped forward, his silhouette sharp and skeletal against the gray stone of a fountain. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a statesman in a perfectly tailored charcoal coat, but the coldness radiating from him was more absolute than the mountain winter. Fenris is unpredictable, Lyra replied, her voice low, fighting to keep the tremor out of her hands. He caught me in my quarters. He's questioning the candidates. He rejected the 7th tonight. Silas moved with a slow, serpentine grace, circling her until he was close enough that she could smell the sterile scent of cloves and iron that always followed him. He rejected Isolde, the woman we spent 18 months grooming to be his perfect shadow. He tilted his head, his eyes like 2 shards of flint. That is a failure of your primary directive, Lyra. You are the matchmaker. You are the one who whispers in his ear and tells him what he desires. I can't force a wolf to claim a scent he finds repulsive, Lyra hissed, stepping back. He says she smells of lies. He's suspicious, Silas. If I push too hard, he'll start looking into my past instead of the bride's. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of parchment. He didn't hand it to her. He held it just far enough away that she had to strain to see the messy, youthful handwriting. It was a drawing of a sun, the symbol of their house, sketched in charcoal. Bram's drawing. Your brother asks about you daily, Silas said, his tone conversational and terrifying. He's growing quite tall. But the cellar in the syndicate safe house is damp, and his lungs have always been delicate. It would be a tragedy if he didn't survive the transition to the next moon. The air left Lyra's lungs as if he'd struck her. You promised he'd be safe. Safety is a currency, Lyra. You've spent yours tonight by failing to secure the king's interest. Silas leaned in, his breath cold against her ear. The next moon is the claiming ceremony. If Fenris does not announce his engagement to Isolde by then, Bram will no longer be an incentive. He will be a liability. And you know how I deal with liabilities. He tucked the drawing back into his coat and vanished into the darkness of the willow trees without another word. Lyra stood alone in the shivering garden, the crushing weight of her dual life threatening to break her. She had to find a way to save her brother, but the Alpha King's piercing gaze was starting to feel less like a threat and more like a sanctuary she was destined to betray. The high-arched windows of the royal war room were lashed by a sudden, violent rain, the droplets drumming against the glass like the frantic heartbeat Lyra had been trying to suppress since her meeting with Silas. Maps of the northern territories were spread across the central table, weighed down by heavy bronze markers, but the atmosphere was far from strategic. Fenris sat in a high-backed chair, his formal tunic unbuttoned at the collar, his head resting back against the velvet as he stared at the ceiling with an expression of profound exhaustion. Lyra moved quietly, arranging the latest dossiers on the table, but her gaze kept drifting back to him. The flickering candlelight caught the hard lines of his face, revealing a pallor that hadn't been there during the day. He looked less like an invincible monarch and more like a man being slowly crushed by the very stone walls of his palace. "The border skirmishes in the east are stabilizing, sire," Lyra began, her voice a soft tether in the gloom. "But the council is pressing for a definitive alliance through marriage. They believe it will provide the psychological front the people need." Fenris let out a sound that was half laugh, half growl, his eyes remaining closed. "The people need a leader who isn't rotting from the inside out, Lyra. They want a symbol of strength, while I spend my nights fighting a war against my own blood." He shifted, a sudden wince of pain tightening his jaw, and he instinctively pressed a hand against his left side, just below the ribs. Lyra hesitated, then stepped closer, the professional distance she maintained feeling increasingly like a betrayal. "The headache has returned," she murmured. "And the old wound from the Silver Wars. I can see the way you favor your left side." Fenris opened his eyes, the gray depths clouded with agony. It never truly healed. The healers say the blade was dipped in something that prevents the wolf from knitting the tissue back together. It burns when the pressure drops, as if the metal is still inside me. Driven by a compulsion she couldn't name, Lyra reached into the small satchel she always carried, the one Silas believed held only makeup and forging tools. Instead, she pulled out a small, unlabeled vial of deep blue glass and a tin of pungent, herbal salve. Her hands, usually so steady in their deceptions, trembled slightly as she approached him. "I spent time with the mountain tribes before I became a matchmaker," she lied, though the knowledge of the remedy was a truth she'd guarded for years. "They have a way of drawing out the residual toxins that royal medicine ignores." She knelt beside his chair, and for a long moment, the world narrowed down to the sound of the rain and the heat radiating from his skin. Fenris didn't pull away. He watched her with a raw, quiet intensity as she carefully unbuttoned his vest to reveal the jagged, silvered scar on his torso. It was inflamed, the skin around it tight and angry. As she applied the cooling salve, her fingers moving in practiced, circular motions, she felt the tension drain from his massive frame. He let out a long, shuddering breath, his head dropping forward until his forehead almost touched her shoulder. The scent of her, the citrus and steel, mixed with the earthy herbs, creating a temporary sanctuary. In that moment, the Alpha King was vulnerable, exposing his pain to the one woman sent to destroy him, and Lyra realized the golden weight of the Solari pendant was a heavy heat against Lyra's chest, a constant reminder that Fenris had seen through her mask and offered her a grace she didn't deserve. But as she slipped through the darkened corridors toward the guest wing, the warmth of that trust was replaced by the icy reality of her mission. Silas Graves didn't leave anything to chance, and if Fenris was right about the syndicate's movements, the perfect bride was more than just a political pawn. Isolde's chambers were a testament to curated perfection, scented with lavender, draped in silks, and meticulously arranged to reflect the image of a submissive queen. Lyra moved like a ghost, her fingers gloved in thin silk as she bypassed the jewelry boxes and formal gowns. She wasn't looking for gold, she was looking for the shadow beneath the shine. She checked the hollowed legs of the vanity and the false bottoms of the traveling trunks, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It was inside a hollowed-out heel of a reserved dancing slipper that she found it. A small, wax-sealed vial sat nestled in the velvet lining. Lyra carefully broke the seal, and the faint, bitter scent of almond and rot wafted upward. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't just a sedative. It was a refined concentrate of wolfsbane laced with silver nitrate, a slow-acting neurotoxin designed to mimic the symptoms of a natural decline. In a wolf as powerful as Fenris, it wouldn't kill instantly. It would erode his strength, cloud his mind, and eventually leave him a hollow shell, unable to shift or defend his throne. As she held the vial, the true horror of the syndicate's plan finally crystallized. Silas hadn't just sent a soul to be a bride. He had sent an assassin to ensure the king's slow demise. And Lyra was the one who had cleared the path. A small, folded note was tucked into the same hidden compartment. Lyra opened it, recognizing Silas's sharp, clinical handwriting. Once the claim is made and the first dose administered, clear the Solari loose ends. The boy is no longer required for leverage once the throne is compromised. The paper fluttered from her nerveless fingers. Silas never intended for her or Bram to walk away from this. The promise of freedom was a lie. The safety of her brother was a temporary convenience. Once Fenris was incapacitated, Lyra and Bram were nothing more than witnesses to a regicide, liabilities to be erased. She stood in the center of the room, the silent walls closing in. She had been playing a game where the only prize was a grave. The vial in her hand felt like it weighed a ton, a physical manifestation of the death sentence Silas had signed for everyone she loved. She couldn't just be a matchmaker anymore, and she couldn't just be an operative. To save Bram, and to save the king who had seen the truth in her, she would have to burn the syndicate's world to the ground before they could strike the match. The storm had returned with a vengeance, rain lashing against the stone battlements as Lyra stood before the heavy oak doors of the king's private chambers. The vial of wolfsbane felt like a lead weight in her pocket, a cold promise of the death she had been sent to deliver. She didn't knock. She simply pushed the doors open, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps that tasted of salt and terror. Fenris was standing by the hearth, the orange glow illuminating the rugged planes of his face. He didn't look surprised to see her. He looked as though he had been waiting for the world to finally tilt on its axis. "Lyra," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to anchor her to the floor. "I can't do it," she whispered, the words spilling out of her like blood from a fresh wound. She walked toward him, her hands trembling so violently she had to clench them into fists at her sides. "I was never just a matchmaker, Fenris. I am a weapon forged by Silas Graves. I was sent here to put a crown on a murderer's head and a slow, agonizing death in your veins." She pulled the vial from her pocket and slammed it onto the table between them. The glass rattled, the dark liquid inside shimmering like a threat. "Isolde brought this. It's wolfsbane concentrate. It was designed to hollow you out from the inside while I stood by and watched." The tears she had held back for years finally broke, hot and blurring her vision. "And Silas, he has my brother. Bram is only 12. He's in a cellar somewhere, cold and terrified, because Silas knew he was the only leash that would ever hold me." Fenris didn't move toward the vial. He didn't summon the guard. He kept his eyes locked on hers, his expression unreadable, but his presence immense. "I was supposed to ruin you," Lyra choked out, stepping into his space, her composure completely shattered. "I was supposed to be the hand that guided the blade. But every time you looked at me, every time you saw the woman behind the mask, I felt the lie dying." She reached out, her fingers brushing the heavy wool of his tunic, seeking the warmth of the man she was destined to betray. "I love you, and because I love you, I am a dead woman. Silas will kill Bram, and then he will kill me, because I choose your life over our mission." She waited for the anger, for the kingly justice that should have followed such a confession. Instead, Fenris reached out, his massive hands cupping her face with a tenderness that hurt more than any blow. He wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumbs, his gaze fierce and unwavering. "You are not a dead woman, Lyra Solari," he growled, his voice thick with a sudden, protective fury. "And your brother is not a casualty. You chose the truth tonight. Now, you will watch what a king does for the woman who saved his soul." The war room was no longer a place of quiet vulnerability, but a furnace of cold, tactical fury. Fenris moved with a lethal efficiency that Lyra had never witnessed, his presence expanding to fill every corner of the stone chamber. He didn't waste time with comforting platitudes. Instead, he summoned his elite shadow guard, warriors who moved like the very darkness they occupied. Among them stood Bram's closest friend, a young but weathered scout named Eris, whose eyes burned with a personal vendetta against the syndicate that had snatched his companion away. The syndicate safe house at the Blackwater docks is a fortress of iron and silence, Fenris growled, his finger tracing a jagged line on the map. They expect Lyra to remain a silent accomplice until the moon rises. We will use that expectation against them. He turned to Eris, placing a heavy, steadying hand on the boy's shoulder. You know the crawl spaces. You know where they keep the liabilities. Lead my riders through the back marshes. If a single hair on that boy's head is harmed, level the building. Leave no one to tell the tale. Eris nodded, his jaw set in a hard line. I'll bring him back, sire. Or I won't come back at all. As the scout and the riders vanished into the rainy night, their horses' hooves muffled by the downpour, Fenris turned back to Lyra. The air between them was electric, charged with the desperate gamble they were taking. You have the hardest part, Lyra, he whispered, his voice softening just enough for her to hear. You must go to the garden. You must face Silas Graves and convince him that the poison is in place, that the king is fading, and that you are still his loyal hound. Every minute you keep his eyes on you is a minute Eris has to get Bram out. Lyra straightened her spine, the Solari pendant hidden beneath her bodice feeling like a brand of courage against her skin. He's spent years reading my tells, Fenris. If I flicker for a second, he'll know. Then don't flicker, Fenris commanded, though he reached out to pull her into a brief, crushing embrace. His scent, rain, pine, and pure, unyielding power wrapped around her like armor. Think of the brother you're saving. Think of the man who is waiting for you to return. Silas thinks he owns the shadows, but tonight, the shadows belong to us. Lyra stepped out of his arms and into the cold hallway, her face settling into a mask of practiced, syndicate-born indifference. She descended toward the gardens where the clove-scented rot of Silas Graves awaited her. Her heart was a frantic drum, but her steps were steady. She wasn't just a matchmaker or a victim anymore. She was the bait in a trap designed to snap shut on the monster who had stolen her life. As she caught sight of Silas's skeletal silhouette near the fountain, she let out a long, shuddering breath and stepped into the light, ready to play the most dangerous game of her life. The scent of cloves and iron arrived before Silas did, a cold gust of wind that seemed to extinguish the festive warmth of the palace's grand vestibule. He entered with the silent, predatory confidence of a man who believed the world was finally bending to his will. The selection ball was reaching its peak, the music swelling and the court dressed in their finest silks, all gathered to witness the Alpha King claim a bride who is nothing more than a syndicate puppet. Silas's eyes found Lyra standing near the dais, her face a mask of pale, frozen obedience. He offered her a minuscule, terrifying nod, the signal to finalize the ruin of the Ulric line. The king looks remarkably steady for a man whose blood should be turning to lead, Silas murmured as he glided to Lyra's side, his voice a low hiss beneath the music. I trust the dosage was sufficient. He is a wolf of high pedigree, Silas, Lyra replied, her voice taut, every nerve ending screaming as she played her part. He fights the decline, but the hollow is there. Look at his eyes. Silas turned his gaze toward the throne, where Fenris sat in shadow. The king leaned heavily on one arm, his expression hooded. Satisfied, the handler stepped forward, intending to guide his soul toward the king's side. But as his foot hit the marble of the inner circle, the music didn't just stop. It died in a discordant clash of strings. The heavy iron doors of the ballroom slammed shut with a boom that echoed like a guillotine blade. The guests in the immediate vicinity, the courtiers Silas had ignored, shifted in unison. They weren't nobles. They were the shadow guard, their hands moving as one to the hilts of their concealed blades. You've always been so fond of leverage, Silas. Fenris's voice erupted, no longer a rumble of exhaustion but a roar of pure, unleashed power. He stood from the throne, his massive frame radiating the lethal vitality of a predator who had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But leverage only works if you're the one holding the end of the rope. Silas's hand flew to his inner pocket, but he froze. From the shadows behind the throne, a small, familiar figure stepped out. Bram was pale and his clothes were tattered from the safe-house cellar, but his eyes were bright with a defiant fire. He wasn't cowering. He was holding a heavy crossbow, aimed directly at the handler's heart, his small hands steady with a courage that mirrored Lyra's. Beside him stood Eris, the scout's blade already drawn and stained with the soot of the syndicate's fallen fortress. The blood drained from Silas's face, leaving him looking like a gray, weathered corpse. The mask of the statesman shattered, revealing the frantic, cornered rat beneath. He looked to Lyra, his eyes wide with the realization of her betrayal, but she only met his gaze with a cold, piercing clarity. She stepped toward her brother, her hand finding the Solari pendant at her throat. The trap hadn't just closed, it had erased him. In the center of the king's court, the man who had traded in human lives found himself the only liability left in the room. The heavy scent of ozone and iron from the night's confrontation still lingered in the corners of the grand ballroom, but the shadow guard had moved with such surgical precision that the court was left in a state of breathless, stunned suspension. Silas Graves had been dragged into the depths of the palace, his syndicate of shadows decapitated in a single hour of royal fury. The 7 brides-to-be stood like pale statues in their finery, realizing with a cold collective dawning that the throne they had been promised was never truly within their reach. Fenris stepped into the center of the dais, the light of 1,000 candles catching the gold of his signet ring and the hard, unyielding set of his shoulders. He did not look at the noble families or the foreign emissaries. His gaze was anchored solely to Lyra, who stood by her brother's side. Bram gripped her hand, his small face etched with a mixture of exhaustion and awe, but Lyra's eyes were fixed on the king, the man who had risked his crown to save a woman meant to destroy him. The traditions of this court dictate that a king must choose a queen to shore up his borders and secure his legacy. Fenris's voice rang out, a deep, resonant bell that brooked no dissent. For weeks, you have watched me reject the matches curated for me. You have called it madness. You have called it a failing of duty. He descended the steps of the dais, the crowd parting before him like a dark sea. He stopped inches from Lyra, the heat of his presence surrounding her like a shield. I did not find a queen among the 7 kingdoms, he continued, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble that only she was meant to feel. Because a queen is not a political asset. She is the one who sees the man beneath the crown and heals the wounds no one else can touch. He reached out, his hand covering hers and lifting it for the entire court to see. The ancient Solari pendant burned against her chest, no longer a hidden secret, but a reclaimed birthright. Lyra Solari has saved this kingdom from a rot it didn't even know it carried. She is not a matchmaker. She is my mate, my equal, and the only woman who will ever sit by my side. A shocked silence gripped the room, followed by the low, growing murmur of a world changing in real time. Fenris leaned down, his forehead pressing against Lyra's in a gesture of primal, absolute devotion. The citrus and steel of her scent mingled with the pine of his own, a perfect, fated alignment. The era of the syndicate's shadows was over. The era of the sunbright Solari had begun. In the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the remnants of a war they had won together, Lyra finally let go of the fear that had defined her life. She was no longer an operative or a pawn. She was claimed, she was loved, and for the first time in a decade, she was home.